With the new MacBook Pro, Apple is playing catch-up with the rest of the PC industry by adding Intel's latest CPUs and some slight hardware tweaks. It's a classic Apple refresh, since it hasn't changed much. Put the MacBook Pro side by side with last year's model, and it's impossible to tell the difference. The slim unibody aluminum case Apple introduced in 2016 is back, along with the Touch Bar, which is still a love it or hate it affair. The MacBook Pro is sleek and stylish, even compared to thinner and lighter notebooks like HP Spectre, and unsurprisingly, it still feels tough as nails. Apple has made a big deal about the new keyboard, which has been refined a bit to make typing quieter and less clicky, a common complaint among users. You can certainly hear a difference with the new hardware, but it's not exactly night and day. According to iFixit, the new silicone layer underneath the keys that makes them quieter could also protect them from dust and debris. So this might be a stealth fix for the previous MacBook Pro keyboard issues that led to a class action lawsuit against Apple. Apple is fixing those old machines for free, but still hasn't said directly how it's preventing future dust problems. Personally, the so-called upgrade isn't enough. I've never been a fan of Apple's flat butterfly switch keys, since they have no depth and it really feels like you're typing on a flat surface. If Microsoft can squeeze a decent amount of key travel out of the Surface keyboard cover, Apple has no excuse. We tested the 13-inch model, which features Apple's mainstay 2560 by 1600 pixel Retina display. It can finally take advantage of Apple's True Tone technology, which relies on an ambient light sensor to change the white balance of the screen and touch bar depending on your environment. That's meant to make screens appear more natural, as if you were looking at a white piece of paper. In more disappointing news, since we're getting the same MacBook Pro case as before, that also means we're still stuck with 4 USB-C Thunderbolt 3 connections. At least that seems less egregious than it did 2 years ago. You won't have to try too hard to find USB-C cables and accessories these days, but it would still be nice to have one traditional USB port and an SD card reader. That would be useful for creative workers who invested in expensive accessories and now have to lug around USB-C dongles. The Touch Bar is, well, the Touch Bar. It's useful sometimes, but I still miss the reliability of traditional function keys. The biggest upgrades with this new MacBook Pro are under the hood. Apple is finally using 8th generation Intel processors, which launched last year. The 13-inch model features quad-core i5 and i7 chips with turbo boost speeds up to 4.5 GHz, while the 15-incher has 6-core i7 and i9 processors that can reach 4.8 GHz. The bigger model can also be configured with more elaborate hardware, including up to 32 GB of RAM, a 4 TB SSD, and dedicated Radeon Pro 560X graphics. In comparison, the 13-inch machine maxes out with 16 GB of RAM, a 2 TB SSD, and integrated Intel Iris Plus 655 graphics. Finally, the laptops feature Apple's T2 chip, which makes booting and file encryption more secure by bringing things like the audio and SSD controllers into a single location. It also lets you shout "Hey Siri" to a Mac for the first time. That's nice to have, but it's still not very smart. If you have an iPhone nearby, Siri will pop up on both devices and get very confused. Hey Siri, what's the weather?
Here's the forecast for today.
You could call these new MacBook Pros Apple's apology to prosumers. Sure, many of them would have liked their old ports back, or a card reader at the least. But the sheer amount of power under the hood at least makes them appealing upgrades. And it's about time. I've talked to plenty of Mac fans who are ready to jump ship to more versatile and capable Windows machines. The easiest way to break down the MacBook Pro's capabilities is with benchmarks. In Geekbench 4's multi-core test, our Core i7 13-inch model scored a whopping 18,837 score, compared to around 15,200 from similarly spec'd machines last year. According to Geekbench's website comparisons, the MacBook Pro is almost 1,000 points faster than a 2013-era Mac Pro with a 6-core Xeon processor. What all that really means is that if you're doing heavy CPU work, like video and audio editing, or compiling tons of code, you'll notice an improvement. Unfortunately, we didn't have a Core i7-equipped MacBook Pro from last year to directly compare, just an i5 model. But we can still draw a few comparisons from the video conversion app Handbrake. When we tried to transcode a 15-second 4K clip with the software's super high-quality 1080p setting, the new MacBook Pro averaged an encoding speed of 7.5 frames per second. Last year's i5 model, on the other hand, clocked at 4.6 frames per second. And in Cinebench, the new MacBook Pro reached a score of 600, while the older one clocked in at 379. I was surprised I could even play games decently on the new machine. Tacoma hovered between 30 and 35 FPS, while playing at the screen's native resolution. You wouldn't mistake the 13-inch MacBook Pro for a gaming laptop, but at least you can still dip your toes into something fun. Another nice upgrade, Apple has rebounded with some decent battery performance. Our laptop lasted 12 hours and 25 minutes in our standard battery test, which involves looping an HD video until it dies. That's a nice jump forward from 2016, when it clocked in just under 10 hours. The 13-inch MacBook Pro with the Touch Bar starts at $1799 with a Core i5 processor, 8GB of RAM, and a 256GB SSD. It's worth bumping up your memory and storage though, but it'll cost you an additional $400 to snack 16GB of RAM and a 512GB SSD. If you're looking for a good deal, and you don't want the Touch Bar, there's still the entry-level MacBook Pro at $1299. The only problem is that it's stuck with a paltry 8GB of RAM and a 128GB SSD. While it's heavier, the 15-inch model is better suited for more serious work. It starts at $2399, but at least it gets you 16GB of RAM and dedicated Radeon 555X graphics. And if you're dealing with complex audio and video editing, you'll appreciate the larger screen. There's also finally an external graphics option specifically designed for Macs, the $699 Blackmagic eGPU. It features AMD's Radeon RX 580, which will speed up video encoding and let you play a few games. Outside of Apple devices, there are a ton of compelling PCs like Dell's XPS lineup and HP's Spectre. We're also looking forward to Asus's ZenBook Pro, where the trackpad is actually a small touchscreen. That could just end up being a gimmick, but in theory it can do much more than the Touch Bar. If you've been a Mac loyalist for years, it's worth taking a look to see what else is out there. While this latest MacBook Pro generation might seem understated, it's a more significant upgrade than last year, when Apple just added some aging CPUs. They're more powerful than ever before, though if that's your main concern, you should definitely lean towards the 15-inch model. But it's also clear that Apple's falling a bit behind the competition, which have been offering the same CPUs and better graphics for months. These machines are meant to appease Apple's fans, not win over new ones.